This week's events, or the past week's events, are a toxic mix of legacy and an ongoing failure of governance. How do we reimagine a different South Africa as we rebuild after a week of looting and destruction? The co-founder of ReimagineSA Dr, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, joins us now to talk to this issue and more. Dr. Ramphele, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Firstly, I mean, when I read your piece, I don't know whether you were having a sociological discourse in that particular piece, the likes of Emile Durkheim, or you wanted to go a different route, but maybe we'll have that sociological conversation anyway. What is it that is bringing society together? I think that's where we could start.
What brings society together is the realization by each and every citizen that we have the power to shape the future we would like. And reimagining a different future from the one we have is the first step. The second step is to know that we have all we need to shape that reimagined future. We have countless examples this past week of young people, and this made me absolutely glow with pride. Young people coming up like Unhlanhla in Maponyamo. He didn't wait for leaders to come. He didn't wait for the older people to come. He stood up and called them together and said, we have to defend our infrastructure, which means we defend what we have, we defend our democracy, we defend our right to choose what we want to do. Because what we witnessed last week is the abuse of people who are hungry, who are poor, to drive an agenda by people who have already destroyed our country, who have stolen the hopes of so many that we had post-1994.
Yeah.
And today, we have to make a commitment with ourselves, recommitment, that we are the people who are going to shape the future we want. And as you said, having that consciousness that we are born to be free as human beings. Yeah. And our ancestors taught us the way to succeed in that freedom is to recognize that we are interconnected, interdependent. Ilento sibiza ubuntu.
Yeah.
Once we play that strong card, Ubuntu, no one can abuse us. We will not allow anybody to use us as their cannon fodder to burn our own infrastructure, to steal from ourselves. We have dignity as a people, and that's what this moment calls for.
Now, we saw individuals coming together collectively, one would say, because of indignation, right? A collective brought together by indignation. What does that say about our moral attitudes? And of course, it's a generalization because it didn't happen throughout the country. We saw it happen in two provinces in particular. But what does that say about the moral attitude of those who were participating?
The issue is we have this freedom today because in the difficult years of apartheid, people didn't wait to sell their souls to buy a bag of meal or to get 250 rand or whatever. People used that moral indignation to revolt against their humiliation. We as citizens of this country have to recognize that the dream of a post-1994 that would bring forth the dignity, the self-respect, the social justice that enables each and every person, however poor, however old or young, to be able to feel that they own the country. Instead, people were sold RDP houses, social grants, the sort of thing that you give to a baby, dummies. People are now saying we are done with dummies, and they have to say that much louder. I hear you talked about sociology. There are sociologists who are arguing for basic income grants. Here in Africa, to be a human being, you have to earn your livelihood. People are not fighting. People didn't die to get social grants. People died to restore the dignity of people. The dignity of an adult is to be able to earn your living. So we must, in addition to rejecting state capture and all of the things that have impoverished us, also reject the dummies of basic income grants or social grants that are humiliating our grandparents, our young women, and our young people who are all forever waiting to be given something. In Africa, to be an adult, you have to build your own home, you have to earn your keep, and you contribute. It is not expected that each and every one of us will be able to be wealthy and make a lot of money, but it is expected that each and every adult will have the dignity to contribute to the common good.
Dr. Ramphele, they'll argue, right, that we don't have that dignity to contribute, for example, because we have no land. Land was taken away from us. Talking of adults who will be able to build. They'll say, on what piece of land are we going to be able to build? Others will say, we don't have that dignity to do that because the policies of this country are lopsided and in favor of the elite and those who have. Those who do not have, they don't have room to breathe in this particular space.
Absolutely, I agree that for people to restore their full dignity, they need to have that sense of ownership. And the land is the psychological, the spiritual connection to that ownership. Having said that, our grandparents, who also had their land taken away from them, they did not sit down and wait for social grants. The little that is around you, you use to be able to restore that dignity, even if it is not to the full extent. The question of the policies that are so wrong-headed is one that you and I as citizens have to take responsibility for. We keep voting the same government that destroyed our cities, destroyed our towns, destroyed our land, and continue to steal from ordinary people. It is not magic, and it is not about hating anybody. It is about what future do we want. Look at our education system. I'm here as a rural woman from Limpopo village. What made me come all the way today to be sitting where I'm sitting? Because I got a very good education in the context of Bantu education. But our teachers said, even if we don't have the right policies, we as the teachers are going to do right by our children. And we have, even today, very excellent schools, like the Leap School for Math and Science, in the poorest shacks in this country. But the dedication of teachers has made a difference. So you don't have to have the full restoration of the land and all the right policies, but you have to make do with what you have while your eye is focused on that future.
Yeah. Education,
we,
education
the
certainly.
people, must use our power to elect the right people to lead us.
Yeah. Education is certainly one of those social institutions that assist in building citizens that are compliant and citizens that are ready to work. I want us to interrogate the other social institutions, including police, the judiciary, the media, as well as, of course, the state itself and the role that they play. In a moment when we continue, the co-founder of ReimagineSA Afrika, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. Conversation with the co-founder of ReimagineSA, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. And of course, taking your views tonight on WhatsApp and your comments on Twitter at Newzroom405 or on 072-110-5584. She penned a piece titled Looting and Violence, a Toxic Mix of a Legacy of Governance Failures. And of course, that's the conversation we are having tonight, a lack of a collective consciousness to I suppose, rebuild and pursue common ideologies. Speaking of common ideologies, Dr. Mamphela, the nation, I mean, if we have to face the brutal honesty of how divided it is, we're talking 13 political parties in parliament, I could be wrong, or I think over 49 of them that registered candidates in 2019. I mean, that in itself tells you of how divided our society is in terms of ideologies that bind us together. How do we find a unifying force within society when such divide exists?
I think we need to recognize that what you are talking about, the fragmentation of political parties, is not a reflection of the fragmentation in society. Political parties are seen as conduits to patronage. That's what public service has become. And so I would like us to go back to the issue of education, which we were on, and link it to the question you raised about police and the rest of the public service. The fact of the matter is, without education, which is self-liberating, and if you go back to 1976, what made those young people stand up against a brutal apartheid force was because they woke up and said, we are no longer non-whites. We are black and we are proud. And what we are calling for is a consciousness that says we are proud citizens of this beautiful country, regardless of what we don't have. And when we have that focus, that self-liberating education is what will give us the police, the civil servants, and even private sector people who operate on the basis of, I have to do good in order to do well, which means that you don't have to be wealthy at the expense of other people. You become an enabler of everyone to prosper. And people come with different aspects of their own talents to build this beautiful country into the reimagined South Africa that so many people sacrifice their youth and their lives. It is possible. We have seen it last week, that people actually stood up and remembered that they are a great people, that they are not going to allow instigators of looting and burning to win, that their country is more important than the short-term gains of a fridge or a TV screen.
What you're talking about, you're saying education is able to foster patriotism in a sense of belonging and ownership of this land. The state has failed to do that as one of the social institutions that foster a collective consciousness. What are the failings in the state to foster and create that sense of patriotism?
Our current government despite all the advice that they were given, has not paid attention to making sure there is self-liberating education, because it is so much better, as they say, to keep mushrooms in the dark. Then they become tools. They become voting fodder. They become our people, quote unquote, who can be told what to do, where to go, and how to vote. What we have seen last week is that despite not having had that self-liberating education, the fire of dignity in each and every human being shone through when people decided, no, this is not the way. We are not going to listen. Whoever is telling us to do whatever, we're going to do the right thing. Ubuntu is the ultimate philosophical orientation from this continent that enabled human beings living in the wild to evolve into who we are today. And it is that Ubuntu which is going to help us as South Africans to rediscover how to be a people united in our diversity and not distracted by having. Ubuntu is about being. But what has happened over the last 27 years, what matters is what you have. Now, last week, people said, that's not what matters. What matters is who I am, the being, Ubuntu betu. So I am very, very encouraged by what I saw last week. Yes, I cried to see my country burning, but I'm also very happy and celebratory and thankful that the humanity in us has survived all the trials and tribulations. And we must not be distracted by people coming with one more dummy of basic income grant. We must demand high quality, self-liberating education. We must demand land reform, land restitution that enables people to earn their own living. We must demand a human settlement policy that's not about RDP houses, which are even worse than the mesh boxes of the apartheid state. We have the capacity to build human settlements that are enriching, that restore our dignity, that build communities, and that make us a proud people.
One of the other social institutions that is bemoaned or maybe even highly contested in society is the news and popular media institutions, and whether or not they are spreading the correct ideas in society today and in building that collective consciousness. What's your critique of how the news and popular media in the country have been carrying news and ideas in society today?
Unfortunately, technology is a two-edged sword. I can tell you how technology has been used by the Leap School model, for example, to teach and retain and make sure children excel throughout this whole coronavirus lockdown period last year and up to the end, up to now. So there is that positive side of technology. There is also the positive side of technology to connect young people across boundaries. But there is a negative, and that negative thrives when people do not have critical thinking, which is why the greatest failing of the ANC government is its failure to transform education into the self-liberating education that lots of people in the struggle establish models to show how it can be done. They neglected all those models and brought to this country foreign models which have failed. And by doing so, they have deprived generation upon generation the ability to develop a critical capability to be able to see fake news, smell it 10 kilometers from where you are. You can't get me into a fake news situation. Why? Because I'm going to ask you, how does that make sense? That's what self-liberating education does. And so we mustn't blame the media. We mustn't blame social media. We must make sure we challenge whoever wants to be in the leadership of this country. If they are not going to transform our education system, they must not get our vote. Because that's how you kill a nation, by feeding our children 3rd, 12th grade education. It really is a tragedy and cruel irony, because the freedom of this country was won because of the spark lit by children who were objecting to inferior education. And here we are today, feeding young South Africans, 2021, inferior education. It's a scandal that we, the people, must put a stop to.
When we come back next, we ask the question, what of the youth, particularly as you are highlighting, who are rejecting the judiciary system or the justice system in the country, saying it's foreign, it doesn't take into consideration, for example, the values that we talked about earlier on of Ubuntu. Let's talk in conversation tonight with the co-founder of ReimagineSA, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. To be a part of the conversation, WhatsApp your questions right now to 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us at Newzroom405 with what your thoughts are tonight as we discuss some of the social institutions thought of in the world to be those that build collective consciousness. And we're asking the question, how do we use our collective consciousness now to heal from the disaster and the kind of burning that we saw in the country, in Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal in the past week. Police and the judiciary, I said before the break, young people rejecting the judicial system, saying it's Roman Dutch, it's Western ideas, it doesn't incorporate Ubuntu. I mean, one of the things that they point to, of course, to support their point in this current situation is, why would a judiciary send a 79-year-old man who is sickly to jail?
I don't know which youth you are talking about, Buti, because the young people I work with, and I work with a lot of young people are critical of some of the colonial heritage that stays on in, as you say, the reference to Roman Dutch law. But they don't reject the constitutional arrangements of this country that are based on Ubuntu, which is what human rights, the human rights framework is about. So there is a tendency, which is, again, part of fake news, to say youth rejects the judiciary. That is untrue. They may be critical of aspects of it, but young people I know, I meet, are very strong proponents of Ubuntu and human rights regime that we have in the country. Where the problem is in how we implement and we make sure that the policies that we have in the country are aligned to a Ubuntu framework. The question of a 79-year-old sickly old man, I think the big question to ask is, what was that old man doing still in my country when I lost my friends, my dear comrades who fought for this freedom? For him to give our country to a family called the Guptas, he deserves to be where he is and to be there for a very long time, because he has stolen the hopes of the people of this country. And he didn't do it by mistake. He also destroyed our institutions. We have a national intelligence system, a police system, a military system that couldn't even organize themselves out of a paper bag to stop a third-rate insurrection because of him, but also because of his organization that knew what he was doing and protected him all these years. So I have to tell you that the most important thing for this country as part of the healing is to recognize that there is no place in our democracy for leaders like him who have enriched themselves and impoverished so many and destroyed our constitutional institutions. There's no place for him except where he is. He should have been there earlier, and I hope he'll stay there for a very long time.
Let's look at peace and stability then through the prism of what the president was saying yesterday in his lecture address for commemorating 103rd birthday of the late former president Nelson Mandela. He says we need to recognize that there will be no peace and stability without the unity of the African National Congress. Should society reject that idea completely?
With the contempt it deserves. It is the African National Congress that tolerated all of these things that have come together into that toxic mix that I spoke about last week. If the African National Congress wants to earn our respect, it's got to clean its house. I have no doubt that Utata Madiba, if he was here today, he'd be crying. He went to his maker a disappointed man because he could see the signs of this destruction, of the things that so many of them sacrificed their youth and their lives. The idea that the ANC is a leader of the people is such a non-democratic idea that every political party has a chance, or should have a chance, to make a case for why the people should trust it. And when they fail, they should be toughed out. That's what democracy is about. There is no party in the world that calls itself democratic, that assumes that it is the leader of society. Their membership is a tiny fraction of the 60 million people of this country. But even if people were to accept the fact that they have made some contribution, some measure of humility is needed by the ANC, given the pain they've visited upon this country. And I believe that it is time for South Africans, as they did last week, to know they're on their own and to believe that they can be able to rebuild their country. Look at our cities, look at our municipalities, all lying in waste by the so-called leader of the society. No. We need young people to run for leadership of the wards they live in, the towns they live in, the cities they live in, so they can rebuild. We have civil engineers, we've got retired engineers. They should club together with the youngsters and rebuild their country. The beautiful thing about our constitution is that we don't need political parties to run our democracy. Citizens have got a right to elect one another and to be able to entrust them with governance, and if they fail, accountability requires them to be recalled. So this idea that someone has been born with the right to lead is totally undemocratic. And we've got to stop that. And that is why it's so important to have an education system that enables young people to listen to that and say, but how can you have that in a democracy? And also, people who are professionals who say that, they need to ask themselves, why are they being so lacking in imagination? Because any critical thinking person would know that no one should be bound to make the same choice over and over, whatever the failures. That is not what freedom is about.
Let's talk then about what you mentioned here in your piece. You're saying this is a tremendous opportunity to reimagine our socioeconomic development approach and time to incorporate a homegrown integrated development model. What does that look like?
Well, just look at what has happened to our country since 1994. A lot of people this week were saying how wonderful things were, we were able to grow at 5%. But we left people behind. The neoliberal economic model, which is what we use, we rely on being evaluated by the Moody's and all these companies that at the end of the day, what they're looking for is where they can make the quickest, fastest buck for no effort. And the likes of the World Bank and the IMF, even they today have recognized that the likes of China, whom they regarded as not doing the right things, are not a fan of necessarily the Chinese model. But what the Chinese did was to look at what is of value that they can learn from the World Bank. They borrowed money from the World Bank, not because they needed it, but because they needed the technical skills to be able to run large programs in China. But their philosophical orientation was 100% Chinese. We need to ask ourselves as Africans, what is the development model we would like to have to be able to not leave anybody behind, to be able to live our indigenous knowledge of Ubuntu, the interdependence, interconnectedness. How can we then enhance that with the amazing scientific and technical knowledge we have in this country? And also to learn from others who have succeeded. What can we learn from the World Bank that they have picked up from countries that have succeeded? What can we learn from New Zealand, which, despite this COVID-19, has managed as a tiny little country to continue to cater for the well-being of all their citizens? So this is what I'm asking for. Not to wait for the World Bank to tell you what is you should or shouldn't do, or Moody to tell you you are downgraded. I want to know, why is Moody not downgrading America under Trump? If they are so meticulous in judging governance, good or bad, why didn't they downgrade America? America remained AAA under Trump. So that gives you the answer. That this is a smoke and mirrors system. We need to say to ourselves in the first place as citizens, we have the know-how, we have the people, we have the infrastructure, we have the raw materials here in South Africa to be able to grow an inclusive economic model that is able to provide for the socio-economic needs of everybody, restore their dignity, provide high quality education for every child, training technical and otherwise, for every young person, and be able to grow into a society where people feel they belong. Where people feel they belong, there is very little violence, very little crime, because people feel they co-own what's there. And so all I'm saying is, if we continue on this neoliberal model, we will never ever be able to transform our economy away from its continuing white male-dominated model to the broad base of South Africa's people.
Yeah.
And to the extent we're not doing that, we are denying ourselves the ability to grow a sustainable, peaceful, just society. It's possible. We have seen it in the streets of Soweto. We have seen it in Phoenix. We have seen it where people came together. And that moment, they knew they have all they need for the success that they wish for.
Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you. The co-founder of Reimagine South Africa with us tonight here on In Focus.